All right, get ready, because today we're diving deep into Dogwood Therapeutics. That's DWTX on the NASDAQ. The company is working on some seriously interesting drugs, and they're aiming at those medical needs that, don't really have great solutions right now. And we're not just talking about the possibility of blockbuster drugs, although, yeah, that's part of it, but also this company has to navigate a really tricky financial situation. Think potential mergers, not a lot of cash, and the risk of losing really important assets. So, you ready to jump in?
I think what makes Dogwood so interesting is that they have like three major drug candidates that they're working on, all at different stages of development. So we'll unpack each one, talk about the potential impact, and look at what kind of timelines we're realistically thinking about here.
And that's where things get even more interesting, right? Because, yeah, these drugs have a ton of promise, but
Yeah.
Dogwood is kind of like working a financial tightrope at the moment.
Mhm.
We're going to explore those risks so you can see the whole picture.
Yeah, that's key with any company, but especially in a field like pharmaceuticals, understanding both the potential and the risks.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's talk about their drug pipeline, which, let me tell you, is full of potential. First up is Halneuron, which could really shake things up in the world of pain management.
So Halneuron, it's what we call a first-in-class drug, meaning that it works in a way that nothing else currently does. That gives Dogwood a real potential edge in the market. It's specifically designed to work on what's called the NaV 1.7 voltage-gated sodium channel. And this channel is super important in how our bodies actually send pain signals.
Okay, so for those of us who don't have a science degree, can you break that down a bit? What does that actually mean, inhibiting the sodium channel? How does that translate to, like, actually relieving pain?
Sure, think about it this way. Your nerves are like electrical wires, right? They send signals all over your body. So when you get hurt, those signals get stronger, louder, and they go to your brain basically shouting, hey, this hurts. These sodium channels, and specifically this NaV 1.7 we're talking about, they're like little gates on those wires. They control how these sodium ions are flowing in and out of the nerve cells, and that flow is what creates those pain signals.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Halneuron is basically closing those gates, and then those pain signals can't get to the brain. Like,
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And this is where the whole first-in-class thing gets really important. Halneuron, it's focused on this NaV 1.7, which is mainly found in those nerves that sense pain. But there are other types of sodium channels, and those are really important for other nerve functions in your body, like how your muscles move and how your heart beats. So by just targeting NaV 1.7, Halneuron can hopefully block pain without causing a bunch of other issues.
that is amazing. And it's a non-opioid treatment, which in today's world with the opioid crisis is a really big deal. And they're focusing on this chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain, CINP, which affects so many cancer patients. Can you imagine having a treatment that can actually deal with that pain without the risk of addiction? I mean, that would be huge.
Oh, absolutely. It would be life-changing for so many people. And the current treatments for CIMP, they're pretty limited, and they often come with a lot of unwanted side effects. What's really promising is that Halneuron has already been tested in over 700 patients in earlier trials, and they haven't seen any signs that it could be addictive.
That's remarkable. So what does the market even look like for a drug like this?
Well, early estimates put the market for something like Halneuron at about $1.5 billion. So yeah, if these trials go well, we could be looking at a real blockbuster drug.
Wow. So where are they in the process right now? When could we realistically see Halneuron available, like prescribed to patients?
Well, right now, Halneuron is in what's called phase 2B trials. They just started giving it to patients, and they're hoping to have some early data, some interim data, by the second half of 2025. If those results are good, and then the later phases go well, it could potentially be available sometime in 2027, 2028. But of course, this all depends on FDA approval, and that's, never a sure thing.
Okay, so it might be a couple of years away, but it's definitely something to watch closely. Okay, so let's move on to their second drug candidate, IMC2. And this one is focused on a problem that unfortunately a lot of us are familiar with these days after the pandemic, long COVID.
Right, IMC2, it's actually a combination of two drugs that are already out there. Valacyclovir hydrochloride, which is an antiviral, and celecoxib, which is an anti-inflammatory. And they're going after two of the most common and also most difficult long COVID symptoms, fatigue and problems sleeping. I mean, millions of people are dealing with this, so if they can find an effective treatment, the impact would be huge.
And they're already seeing some promising results in those early trials, right? I feel like I read something about that.
Yes, you're right. In a recent phase 2A study, IMC2 showed a real measurable reduction in fatigue and sleep problems compared to people who just got a placebo. And what's really interesting is that the FDA has already said that they're okay with using fatigue reduction as the main goal, the primary endpoint for the future research on IMC2. And that kind of agreement with the FDA early on can really help a drug get developed.
That makes sense. So let's say IMC2 keeps showing positive results in these trials. When could we maybe see it as a treatment option for long COVID?
It's hard to say for sure, especially with long COVID, which is such a complex condition. But if the rest of the trials go smoothly and they get FDA approval, we might be looking at a timeline similar to Halneuron, maybe around 2027 or 2028.
Okay, so potentially two groundbreaking treatments on the horizon, both tackling really important medical needs. Now, we can't forget about IMC1, their third drug candidate. This one's aiming to offer some new hope for people with fibromyalgia.
Yeah, IMC1, it's based on this really interesting idea. What if fibromyalgia is actually connected to the herpes simplex virus? It's a combination of famciclovir, which is an antiherpetic drug, and celecoxib, which we just talked about with IMC2.
Hold on, that connection between fibromyalgia and the herpes virus. Can you explain that a bit more? That sounds like a pretty new concept.
It is relatively new, yeah. But there's more and more research suggesting that the herpes virus, specifically HSV1, could be involved in causing or at least making worse the symptoms of fibromyalgia.
Okay, so what kind of research are we talking about here? What kind of evidence is there?
Well, some studies have found that people with fibromyalgia are more likely to have antibodies to HSV1, which means they've been infected at some point. There's also research looking at whether you can find HSV1 DNA in the tissues of people with fibromyalgia. So it's early, but it's something definitely worth looking into.
So does that mean that IMC1 is designed to target this virus and maybe reduce the inflammation that's linked to fibromyalgia?
That's the idea. And the early data is pretty interesting. In one study, 90% of the fibromyalgia patients who got IMC1 said they saw improvements in a bunch of different symptoms, like gut issues, fatigue, anxiety, depression, and of course, the fibromyalgia pain itself.
That's a lot of improvement. So where is IMC1 in terms of development? Is it on a similar track as Halneuron and IMC2?
It's ready to go into phase 3 trials, which is a big step in the drug development world. But before they do that, Dogwood is looking for a partner. Phase 3 trials are really expensive, and they take a lot of resources to manage. For a company like Dogwood, especially with the financial situation we talked about, partnering up with a bigger pharmaceutical company would be a smart move. It helps to split the costs and increases the chances of success.
That makes total sense, especially with those financial challenges we talked about earlier. Finding the right partner could be what they need to get IMC1 finished and out to the patients who really need it. So IMC1 is another one to watch for sure. It could be a real game changer for people with fibromyalgia all over the world.
No doubt the potential is definitely there.
Okay, so we've got three potentially groundbreaking drugs in the pipeline, each addressing a major medical need. But we can't ignore the big problem here, Dogwood's finances.
Right, that's the other side of the story, and it's more complicated. They're facing a real possibility of bankruptcy. They've even said publicly that they don't have enough cash to keep running for the next 12 months.
Whoa, okay. That sounds serious. How much cash are we talking about?
As of September 2024, they only had $2 million in cash. And they did get a loan for $16.5 million back in October, but that's still not enough to cover all their operating costs for a full year.
And I imagine they're going to need even more money on top of that, right? Just to keep things running, not to mention all the costs that come with those clinical trials.
Exactly. They needed another $3 million just last month to get them through 2025. And to actually move forward with those later stage trials, they're going to need a lot more capital.
So how are they planning on raising that much money? What are their options?
Well, one thing they've mentioned is equity financing. It basically means selling more of their stock to get money. It's pretty common for companies in this position, but it comes with its own risks.
And for the people who already own Dogwood stock, what does that mean for them?
It basically means dilution. When a company puts out more stock, it can make the shares that are already out there less valuable. The existing investors, their ownership in the company shrinks a little.
So even if the share price goes up, the people who already own stock might not see their investment go up as much because they own a smaller piece of the company, right?
That's it. And the thing is, Dogwood, they have a history of dilution. Their share price is down almost 99% since their IPO, and part of that is because they've increased the number of shares that are out there.
Oof, that's gotta hurt. That's definitely something for anyone thinking about investing to consider. Is there anything else that could affect their most promising drug, Halneuron? Anything else that could change things up?
Actually, yeah, there is. We call it the seal bond situation. So seal bond, it's another company, and they actually have what's called a repurchase option for Halneuron. Basically, if certain conditions are met, they can buy back all of the intellectual property, everything to do with Halneuron from Dogwood.
Wait, so Dogwood could be putting all this time and money into this potentially amazing drug, and then another company could just come in and take it.
It's a risk, for sure,
Mm.
and it's not something to ignore. Now, the details of this repurchase option, they're complicated, and it's not a guarantee that Sealbine will actually do it, but investors need to know about it. If Halneuron is the main reason you're looking at Dogwood, you have to think about the fact that they might not even own the rights to that drug down the road.
Okay, that's another layer of complexity here. So we've got a company with 3 drugs that could be revolutionary, but they're also facing a very real threat of bankruptcy and potentially losing their top drug to another company. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and it shows how important it is to really look at both the potential and the risks before you make any investment decisions.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. 3 drug candidates, huge potential, but also some serious financial obstacles. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it would be helpful to dig a little deeper into the science behind these drugs, especially Halneuron. If we understand how it works at a deeper level, we can really get a better grasp of its true potential, and then we can come back and really examine those financial risks and what they could mean for Dogwood's future.
Sounds good to me. We'll be back after a quick break to continue our deep dive into Dogwood Therapeutics. Stay with us.
So welcome back. Let's get a bit more into the science behind Halneuron, Dogwood's leading drug candidate.
Yeah, earlier we talked about how it works by inhibiting that NaV 1.7 sodium channel. But I think to really get what makes this drug so potentially powerful, we need to break down exactly what that means and why that's such a big deal for pain relief.
Right, exactly. So picture your nerves as like electrical wires. They're carrying those pain signals throughout your body. And when you get hurt, those signals get stronger, louder, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They travel to your brain, basically yelling, hey, this hurts. And these sodium channels, especially NaV 1.7, they're like gatekeepers on those wires. They control how the sodium ions are flowing, and that flow is what really creates those pain signals.
Okay, so Halneuron is basically like shutting those gates, and that stops those pain signals from even getting to the brain, right?
Exactly, you got it. And that's what makes Halneuron so unique. It's considered first in class because it's so selective. It focuses specifically on NaV 1.7, which is mainly found in the nerves that sense pain. And that's super important because, other types of sodium channels, they're needed for normal nerve function all over the body, like for your muscles to move right and even for your heart to beat. So by going after just NaV 1.7, Halneuron can hopefully block the pain without messing with all these other important functions.
So that's a big advantage, right? Targeting NaV 1.7 could mean pain relief without those side effects you get with so many pain meds out there.
Yeah, that's the hope. And the fact that it's not an opioid, that's huge, especially with, everything going on with opioid addiction.
And we know they're working on Halneuron for CINP, that chemotherapy-induced neuropathic pain. But could this, work for other kinds of pain, too?
That's a great question. And yeah, absolutely. There's actually a ton of research going on right now looking at how NaV 1.7 is involved in all kinds of chronic pain conditions like diabetic neuropathy, certain types of arthritis, even migraines. So if Halneuron is successful in these trials for CINP, it could open up a whole new world of possibilities for treating pain. I mean, it could really change things up.
Wow, that's really exciting. Okay, but let's shift gears for a second and go back to those financial risks hanging over Dogwood. We talked about bankruptcy and the whole dilution thing if they decide to go with equity financing. But you also mentioned this seal buy-in situation. Can you remind us what that is and why it matters so much for anyone thinking about investing in Dogwood?
Sure. Sealbund is another company, and they have this option to buy back Halneuron. It's called a repurchase option. Basically, under certain conditions, they have the right to buy back all the intellectual property, everything related to Halneuron, from Dogwood.
So wait, Dogwood could be putting in all this work and money to develop this amazing drug, and then another company could just take it away from them.
Yeah, that's the risk. It's a real possibility. Now, the details of how that repurchase option works, they're pretty complex, and it's not a sure thing that Sealbond will actually use that option, but it's something investors need to be aware of. If you're interested in Dogwood mainly because of Halneuron, you have to consider that they might not even own it in the future.
Okay, so that's a big what if hanging over everything. And you mentioned Dogwood is considering equity financing to get the money they need. Can you explain exactly what that means and what it would do to the people who already own stock in Dogwood? I think a lot of people get confused about this.
Yeah, you're right. It can be kind of confusing. So, equity financing, it's basically Dogwood selling more shares of its stock to raise money. It's a common way for companies, especially in biotech and pharma, to fund what they're doing. But the problem is when they issue more stock, it can make the shares that people already own less valuable.
So even if the company is doing well and the share price is going up, the people who own stock now, their investment might not go up as much because they now own a smaller piece of the company, right?
That's exactly it. And Dogwood, they've done this before. Since their IPO, they've increased the number of shares a lot, and that's part of the reason why their share price has gone down.
Okay, so it's a tough spot. They need money to keep developing these promising drugs, but raising that money by selling more stock could hurt the people who already invested in them.
Right. It's a tough balance. There are definitely risks involved. So, for anyone thinking about investing, it comes down to weighing those risks against the potential rewards.
Okay, so we've got a company with a drug that could be revolutionary for pain management, but they're also facing a real chance of bankruptcy and possibly losing that drug to another company. Are there any other financial warning signs, things that investors should be looking out for that maybe aren't so obvious?
One thing to think about is their debt. Like a lot of companies in their position, Dogwood has borrowed a good amount of money to fund their operations. It's a normal thing to do, but it adds to the financial pressure. And they recently reported a net loss of $2.3 million for the third quarter of 2024. So you've got a big net loss, bunch of debt, and they need to raise millions more just to keep going.
It's a lot to think about. And I imagine a lot of companies in biotech and pharma are in similar situations, especially when they're still in those early stages. The big question is, can they get past these financial hurdles and actually get these drugs out there?
Yeah, that's the big question. And that's why it's so important to really do your research if you're thinking about investing in Dogwood. The potential is definitely there, but so are the risks.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on Halneuron, the science, its potential impact, and those financial risks that could really throw things off. But Dogwood has those other two interesting drugs in development, IMC-1 and IMC-2. So let's switch gears and take a closer look at those. Welcome back. So we've spent a good amount of time talking about Halneuron, Dogwood's main drug in development, and all its potential for managing pain. But Dogwood has two other promising drugs in the works, IMC-1 and IMC-2, and these are targeting two very different but really tough conditions, fibromyalgia and long COVID.
Yeah, and what's exciting about both these drugs is that they're taking a completely new approach to treatment, which is always what we want to see in pharmaceuticals. It gives some hope to patients who, haven't had many options before.
Let's start with IMC-1, which is based on that really interesting theory connecting fibromyalgia to the herpes simplex virus. Can you explain that link and the thought process behind this whole approach?
The basic idea is that this virus, specifically HSV-1, could be a trigger for fibromyalgia, or at least make the symptoms worse. Now, this is still pretty new in terms of research, but there's more and more evidence coming out that supports this connection.
We did touch on this a little earlier, but can you give us some specific examples of that evidence, things that point to this link between HSV-1 and fibromyalgia?
Sure. There are studies that have found more antibodies to HSV-1 in people with fibromyalgia, which means they've likely had an infection before. And other research is actually looking for HSV-1 DNA in the tissues of people with fibromyalgia. Now, it's not a slam dunk, but it's definitely interesting and needs more research.
So how does IMC-1 actually go after this virus and maybe help with the symptoms of fibromyalgia? What's the mechanism there?
Well, IMC-1 is a combination therapy, meaning it uses two existing drugs. Famciclovir, which is an antiviral used to treat herpes infections, and celecoxib, which is an anti-inflammatory. The idea is to hit the problem from two sides. So you suppress the virus with famciclovir, and you try to reduce inflammation with celecoxib, and hopefully that relieves those tough fibromyalgia symptoms.
And earlier we mentioned that one study showed some pretty amazing results, 90% of patients who took IMC-1 said their symptoms got better. That's a big deal. So where are they with IMC-1 in terms of development? Could it be available to patients around the same time as Halneuron?
Well, right now, IMC-1 is all set to enter phase 3 clinical trials, which is a huge step towards getting FDA approval. But before they start those trials, they're looking for a partner. Phase 3 trials, they're really expensive and complicated. And for a company like Dogwood, with all the financial stuff we talked about, Partnering with a bigger pharmaceutical company would be a smart move. It helps them share the costs and increases the chances of success.
That makes sense, especially with the whole financial balancing act they've got going on. Finding the right partner could be key to getting IMC-1 out there to the people who need it. So yeah, IMC-1 is definitely one to watch. It could be a total game changer for people with fibromyalgia.
Yeah, for sure. It has huge potential.
Okay, let's talk about IMC-2, Dogwood's drug that's going after long COVID, which has become, a major health problem in the last few years. Can you give us a rundown on IMC-2 and how it works?
So IMC2 is another combination therapy. It also uses valaciclovir hydrochloride, the antiviral from IMC1, and celecoxib for its anti-inflammatory effects. It's a similar approach to IMC1, but instead of focusing just on HSV1, they're targeting a wider range of viruses that might be reactivated or, triggered by that initial COVID-19 infection.
So the idea is that these reactivated viruses could be part of what's causing those long COVID symptoms that just linger.
Right. Fatigue, trouble sleeping, brain fog, muscle aches, these are all symptoms that could be linked to those viruses becoming active again after that initial COVID-19 infection.
And what about IMC-2 in terms of its development? What's next for that one?
They finished a phase 2A study, and it actually showed that IMC2 could reduce fatigue and sleep problems in long COVID patients, and in a meaningful way, too. That's really promising, especially because those symptoms can be so hard to deal with. It's worth noting that, like IMC1, IMC2 has also gotten what's called fast-track designation from the FDA. That means the FDA sees the potential in this drug and is willing to speed up the review process, which could mean it gets approved faster.
That's great to hear. It sounds like both IMC-1 and IMC-2 could really make a difference for people dealing with these tough and often ignored conditions. Okay, let's take a step back and look in the big picture. Dogwood Therapeutics, they have a very impressive pipeline, 3 potential breakthroughs, each one aiming at a significant medical need. But they're also up against some serious obstacles.
Yeah, the financial risks are real, the possibility of bankruptcy, the dilution thing if they go for equity financing, and then the whole seal bind situation. Any of those could derail things for them.
So for people who might invest, or just anyone interested in what happens to Dogwood, what's the takeaway here? What should they keep in mind?
Dogwood Therapeutics, they have a ton of potential, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. The next few years are going to be crucial. If they can get the funding they need, handle these potential problems, and get through those clinical trials, they could really change how we treat pain, fibromyalgia, and long COVID.
It's a really interesting story, but it's definitely a risky one, too. It's like they say, high risk, high reward.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be informed. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you the information you need to think about Dogwood Therapeutics and make your own decisions.
This is definitely a company we'll be watching closely, and we encourage all of you to do the same. We've just scratched the surface here. There's a lot more to uncover and explore, so keep learning, keep asking those questions, and keep